baby.
There we are.
Jeez, look at that. God, he's got balls. He's got balls.
Look at that. Look at that. And look, and another fine hat that he's wearing too.
Jim, thanks so much for joining us, man.
No, it's entirely my pleasure.
What I actually wanted to do is just because I've always said I wanted to sit down at like a tavern or a bar and have you just yap, and Artie yap and Mark Herman yap, and I'm just fucking like, yeah, this is great. So this is what I want tonight. I want you guys to yap, talk about anything, Napoleonics, maybe even fucking Stalingrad. Oh, maybe even Stalingrad. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. I got my work clothes on. I'm ready to go. What are you talking about?
I mean, Jim is always willing to talk about Napoleonics. That's
but what about Stalingrad?
I talk about Stalingrad. I played Stalingrad games.
But are you a connoisseur of Stalingrad history?
Connoisseur? No. That's much like Napoleonics. There are obsessives, and I desperately respect those obsessives. I would not dare tread in. I've certainly played a lot of games based on it. I've even played the L2 game on the subject.
Oh, Streets of
Streets of, yeah.
You would consider yourself a aficionado, not an aficionado, but a Napoleon. I don't want to say aficionado. I want to get a better word than that.
Well, I think the thing you got to know. Let's take Civil War. Okay, because that's let's wander completely away from either one of them and talk about. I'll take my hat off. It's a nice hat, but I'm indoors. But anyway, let's talk about the Civil War. I had when I was getting my PhD, one of the things you had to do is take another discipline. You had to go over, and you can't just stay over here. You got to go wander over there and learn something else. So I did. I went over and I said, well, I'll hang out with these Civil War guys. And I got to know a bunch of people who are historians of the American Civil War. And I was still, at that time, I was a war gamer and I loved war games. And so I started talking to those guys and gals about, well, do you ever go to the Civil War Roundtable? And they would look at me like, are you mental? Why in the name of God would I do that? Not because they're bad, not because they're evil, but because they have what we refer to as antiquarian knowledge. They're the people that can tell you, do you know that the third cousin of Joshua Chamberlain retired to Poughkeepsie and opened up a hot dog stand?
But that's cool.
It is. But when you're trying to analyze the causes of the Civil War, the effects of the Civil War, the place of the Civil War in historiography, whether or not that third cousin owned a hot dog stand in Poughkeepsie is not the most relevant piece of information.
So, Jim, you got your doctorate in
hot dog stands.
And yeah. What did you think? No, it was late medieval, early modern history.
Okay, so you're an expert, for God's sake.
Yeah, late medieval, early modern. Ask me all you want about Tudor Stuart history, and I am ready to go. I can tell you more than you ever wanted to know about Charles I's struggles over ship money.
Okay, so what year do you range?
Well, I mean, look, when you pursue a PhD, the story of any historian who gets into history at the level that I did, citizen of the universe. Oh my God. As you get into that, you start out here, right? You love history. I love history. I love all history. I want to learn about all history. And slowly this happens, right? And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right. That's what a doctorate is.
Yeah. And eventually it gets so narrow.
Why I don't have a doctorate, because that is the opposite of what happened to me.
Right. and frankly, that's what turns a lot of people off. In fact, on my drive home, I'm listening to C.V. Wedgwood's 30 Years War, one of the great books on the topic, and it could never be written as a PhD dissertation. It just doesn't work that way anymore.
Why? It's too general.
Yeah, it's general. It's written in a very conversational tone. It's in some ways becomes bombastic, and it's also very judgmental of the personalities involved, which is rather interesting. But all that aside, you get smaller and smaller and smaller. My first historical love was, I'm going to shock everybody at the table, Napoleonics. But I wanted to look at that, and I looked at that. But eventually, I had one professor, and I think a lot of historians will tell you they had one guy or one gal that made them go, oh my God, that's what I'm in love with. And for me, it was Ronald Edward Zupko at Marquette University. And he made me love the Middle Ages. So I wanted to be in the Middle Ages, but it was going to be about military history. So my thesis was on the 100 Years' War, okay, which was actually longer than 100 years, but I digress. But eventually I wound up working with another director for my master's degree. I had two, Father John Patrick Donnelly, whose expertise was actually in the Reformation. And he was good enough to recommend me to a person that those who follow the history of the 30 Years' War will know by the name of Geoffrey Parker. And his specialty is the Dutch Road, the 30 Years' War, the Dutch Rebellion, and all that other stuff. Well, along a route that I won't detail here, I wound up at Madison working for Professor Johann Somerville. And so by the time I wandered that path, we're talking 15 years of life, I wound up covering a period that's, let's say, 1453 to 1688.
You know, but those must have been the best years of your life, my friend.
You look back, there's a great song by Pat McCurdy. He's a local musician in Milwaukee called "Shitty Little Apartment." That's a memory of, it's basically a love song to his long-term girlfriend, maybe his wife, saying, "Man, remember when we had that shitty little apartment and we had sex on the linoleum floor and that sucked." You know, we loved it. And God, it was great. Oh, it sucked. And I feel the same way. I mean, you do whatever job you got to do. You give blood plasma.
Really?
I was working two jobs and all that other stuff. But I will say that the other thing you discover when you do a PhD, you start out with a pool of people where you're the smartest history guy in the room. You're the history guy. I was known in grade school and in high school as the nerd who loved history. Well, then you go to undergraduate. Oh, there's some more people. They like history. Then you get your master's degree. Now there's some people that like history. And when you go to your PhD, now, oh my God, everybody is there and they're willing to do the same hardcore stuff you are to get your PhD. So, would I do it again at 55? Hell no.
Right.
Do I miss it sometimes? That interchange of being with people that
are
intellectualizing,
man,
that are on fire for it the way you are. Oh my God, I miss it. Yeah. Sure I do.
Yeah, man. So you, what was your dissertation on, by the way?
Dueling in the 16th and 17th century. I sat down with my my director and I said, well, I'm a military historian. And he said, oh, I didn't know you wanted to be unemployed that badly. and he was a wise man. And he said, why? And he said, one thing that is not done, that has not been done adequately, is a discussion of dueling during the latter part of the reign of Elizabeth and the reign of James I, who hated it. Who hated the practice of dueling, and it became a legal history, actually, more than a military one, because it became a significant legal issue for the early Stuarts. Let's say the period 1603 to 1621.
I don't understand what the legalities of dueling is.
Well, if you want, I'll do the PowerPoint on my dissertation.
Oh, have you watched The Last Duel?
Yeah, I have not.
But
I have not. I did an extensive amount of research on late medieval judicial dueling, so I'm very interested to see it. But I'm still very much in a mode, given my life situation, of, is that on streaming yet? No. Okay, not yet.
Yeah.
But
so,
yeah,
Jim. So then, dueling was not a question of honor; it was a question of politics.
Well, it was okay. Dueling comes out of a lot of different threads, right? I mean, the people who wrote about dueling in the period, they went all the way back to David and Goliath and said, look, that's essentially a duel to determine a battle, right? That's what David and Goliath's story is. It's, all right, you send your best guy, we'll send our best guy. Whoever wins, that side wins, all right? And so it carries all the way through the early period and all the way through the Anglo-Saxon period, into the Norman period, and all the way forward. What happens in the 16th century, though, are two big things. Number one is the growth of the middle class, a group of people who came out and suddenly wanted to be armigerous. They wanted to have coats of arms. They wanted to be able to carry swords. and they wanted guns. Exactly. There's not much difference. They wanted to strap, and you couldn't do that if you didn't have a certain lineage. And the one thing you could do, probably more than anything else, to get people involved in a duel, other than call them a liar, that's number one, is to suggest they weren't properly armigerous, that they had made up their coat of arms. Now it is on. Now it's on. Now we're going to fight, because that was, in some ways, part of their desire to show themselves as something new and as something that was important and relevant.
So a peasant could duel with a royalty.
Oh, no, we're not talking about peasants. We're talking about middle class. We're
Okay,
talking about people with money, because to get a coat of arms, you got to go to the sergeants at arms and bribe them and keep them in cash long enough to get them to draw your pretty picture and get all that stuff to happen. But the number two thing that happens is you get a group of people who use honor like a currency. This is a time before government the way we know it. I mean, government like we know it is nothing like it was back then. It was incredibly diffuse, incredibly dispersed. Queen Elizabeth, you always hear the Tudor state. It was a totalitarian state. Not in any meaningful sense to me. It's too diffuse. It's too dispersed. How do you get in touch with these people? How do you get a hold of these people? So you depend on local officials spread throughout England, and they're the ones that got to run it. Well, who do they give it over to? They give it over to the great houses. What's the currency of a great house? Their honor. This strange, amorphous. I spent literally years trying to come up with a good definition of what honor was. Read Shakespeare. It's everywhere in Shakespeare. Just Google honor, run a search engine through Shakespeare. It's everywhere. And it was an immense deal. At one point in about 1605, James I, who was a coward through and through, the guy wore multiple layers of clothes because he was constantly afraid of being assassinated. James I had no less than 8 pairs of his courtiers square off in duels. And it horrified him, absolutely horrified him. And so what he does is he sends out Sir Edward Coke, his attorney general, to squash this behavior. But like all other laws, they have unintended consequences. And the number one unintended consequence of dueling in the 16th century and into the 17th was that people started to accuse each other of fighting duels just so they could mess them up in court. If you were a judicial official, O great one of the conical nasal helm, I would come to you and say, Ardwulf challenged me to a duel. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? I never challenged you to any kind of a duel. And suddenly I get to drag him into court. We discovered there was a great paper written, well, great. I liked it. It mattered a lot to me. There's a paper written in the middle 90s that said that of the cases brought for dueling in the period I was studying, more than 80% were people who had other litigation against each other. They used it to screw each other in court. So it was this incredibly complex story. It was a joy to write. It probably cost me the hair you see I've lost. But yeah, that's what I spent 6 years of my life doing.
And this was a question I was going to ask you, but he asks it a little bit more. Yeah. So this inbreeding stuff.
Yes. No, it's not the lip, it's the jaw.
It's the jaw.
It's that Habsburg jaw.
Yeah. So this inbreeding stuff was done for a reason, to keep the power.
I mean,
of the house.
this was a problem, right, literally up to the 20th century, though. I mean, this is why Alexei the Tsarevich, son of Nicholas II, was hemophiliac, right? Because of friggin' inbreeding between the royal houses of Europe. It comes in, it continues to happen, and so you have these, genetic maladies brought upon by inbreeding. That is a centuries-old phenomenon.
So it's not because daddy loved, he thought his daughter was hot or something like that. It's because
it typically isn't incestuous, but at least not vertically incestuous. If you can think of a family tree, it's laterally incestuous. That is the reason, though, that there's a famous photograph that's taken shortly before the outbreak of the First World War of the children and grandchildren of Victoria. And when you see...
That's where the hemophilia came from. Victoria.
Yeah. Yep. When you see the King of England next to the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, and they all look like they're brothers.
Yeah, brothers creepily. Who look a lot alike.
Yeah, you know darn well that family tree kind of goes in a straight line.
One of the people to attend on Queen Victoria on her deathbed was the Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Jesus.
Oh no, I mean, it's if you ever, to me, to me, where I would always send people to start, if I'm not sending people to The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, just because I love that book. It's another book you wouldn't write today. But the other book I always love to send people to about the First World War is John Keegan's First World War.
That's a good book. I've read that.
And his point, which is so well taken, is if they'd had a freaking phone, you know, if they'd literally had a phone to pick up and call each other and go, what are we doing? You know, Russia, are you? The Kaiser didn't think Russia was mobilizing. He went on a cruise. You know, Serbia is melting down into what will become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, and he goes cruising on an annual cruise on the Baltic. Why? Because he thought his cousin, my cousin Nicky, who he called him, he'll never march. Yeah. Cousin Nicky will never march. You know, you talk about the tragedy of the First World War. It's so vast and so immense. And this inbreeding, you would think of all the things, the bad it did, one of the good things it would have done, their family. So we can call, come on, we're not going to do this, right? Let's, you know, and then Keegan says, all you had to do was let Austria go punch Serbia a couple rounds. You know, go down there, beat the snot out of them, make them say sorry, and we're done. Not this. No, it's incredibly sad.
So, Napoleon.
Huh.
So Napoleon, where does he factor in this honor and this incestuous lineage or something like that?
Napoleon's a wild card, really.
Yeah. In some ways, he's a reaction to it.
Well, no.
And the whole French Revolution is a reaction to it, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the reasons that France is so well served, even before Napoleon is even a general, is that suddenly you had a very restricted, very limited cast of army officers suddenly thrown open to talent. Sometimes even very cruel talent. And it's like, you know, win or die in some cases. And, the idea that a half-breed Corsican who spoke very poor French, most of his life, actually, and wrote it not much better, could rise from being by the way, a guy who was raised hating France because of what it did to Corsica, could rise to become a captain of artillery, a general, and eventually rule France. That was that was never going to happen in the Ancien Regime. That was something that was only going to happen after the Revolution.
But
so I'd like to, Jim, I'd like to pick your brain. Speaking of Napoleon, which is a subject we suspected might come up, I'd like to pick your brain about periodization, specifically so something I've been wrestling with as a wargaming periodization is what do we call and how do we subdivide the period between the end of the Middle Ages, whenever we say that is, and the beginning of, say, the Napoleonic era, where there happen to be a lot of war games. So what is your position on that?
Well, number one, Father John Patrick Donnelly, that I mentioned earlier, one of the two men I took my master's degree from at Marquette University, he said, he too, and I suspect, Artie, you've probably experienced this academically too. Well, you went to Ohio State, which actually does have some military history love. I was not so blessed. I mean, you had Gilmartin and
I had Gilmartin too.
Yeah, you'd met.
He was great.
Yeah, and that's and I as I've said, I envy you that. I
Mansour, who I never did have, but Mansour was there at the time. I don't know if he still is or not.
Yeah, no, they have been and are very, very well regarded academically, but I never had that good fortune. And Father Donnelly, who was always far better to me than I ever deserved, I should say. But when I sat down, he said, "You really want to do this military thing, huh?" Because his thing was, it was thinkers, was theologians and philosophers in the 16th century. His great work is on Peter Martyr Vermigli. But in any event, he said, "You really want to do this?" Well, you know what? One of the things that has not been done is the Habsburg-Valois Wars. And a lot of that period, that exactly when you talk about, I mean, for me, and look, any date is silly. It's the old joke. It's not like in 476 AD, somebody looked around and went, "Hey, did you hear that? What was that?" Oh, that was Rome falling. That didn't happen. It's a process, and it's the same thing with the end of the Middle Ages. But if you take if there's a useful date, it's 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. That's your start point. And then you enter what historians have generically called the was the. Oh yeah, Scott. That's believe me, Scott. That's exactly why there's any number of people. The Duke of Brunswick. That's one of the reasons he threatens to invade France long before Napoleon's ruling it. It doesn't help that I think it's his sister-in-law is Marie Antoinette. So yeah, that's very much so. But in any event, if 1453 be the start date, you enter into what we call the early modern period, and militarily, you're then talking about the history of Spain and its fights against France, Charles V, all the stuff that's so well covered in Here I Stand. And it rolls out through the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. In 1648, you enter the Lace War period, which, drives us all the way forward to the French Revolution 150 years later. But it's that period, 1453 to 1648, is other than the 30 Years' War, and because they're British, the English Civil War, is to me really undercovered by war games. And it's also, frankly, it's also undercovered in history from a military perspective. That is why Geoffrey Parker, the guy I mentioned earlier, became such a sensation, because his dissertation, which became revolutionary, was on the 80 Years' War, the Dutch Revolt. And nobody had written that. It just had not been done, especially not from the Spanish sources that he found over in Spain. So, when you look at those periods, those are still areas we're seeing more history there, but it does not in any way approach the coverage and the sexy of the 100 Years' War, even the Wars of the Roses, because again, the British were English, we're all English speaking. And then on the back end, Marlborough onto Napoleon. That window of, what does that come to, 150 years, just doesn't get a lot of love.
Jim, did Napoleon stand a chance at Waterloo?
Sure. Define stand a chance. So, can he win the battle?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Really?
Can he win the campaign? Absolutely not.
Why? Because all the Allied powers got together and just outnumbered him?
Let us imagine.
I'll let Jim do it. Go ahead.
Let's imagine a universe in which Grouchy marches to the sound of the guns and interposes himself and crushes Blucher. Let us imagine a universe in which, frankly, let's even scroll the tape back to where I think the campaign is really lost. Let's say Napoleon puts Davout in charge of the same corps Ney is commanding, and
instead of leaving him back in Paris,
as the Minister of War, which just a mind blowing. And let's imagine that Berthier isn't thrown from his apartment on the return of Napoleon and killed
accidentally.
Yeah. You buy me a drink at a convention.
That's not suspicious at all.
It's a long night.
It's literally the Jeffrey Epstein of his day without the other thing.
Yeah. So no, that's exactly it. I mean, he didn't commit suicide. It's amazing that I still see historians say he committed suicide. Everybody knew he was running back to Napoleon. Everybody knew what he was doing. So had he had Berthier back, has he had Davout in command in the field separately and had Ney on a short leash next to him? At that point, Quatre Bras is a wipeout because d'Erlon joins Napoleon or joins Davout at Quatre Bras. And Napoleon gets his win at Ligny. The British are driven aside. They have to retreat to Brussels. The Prussians retreat backwards. And Waterloo never happens. That to me is the real scenario. So yes, hooray, Napoleon, vive l'empereur, he has won. Now what are you going to do with the approximately 500,000 Austrians and Russians that are coming? What's your plan?
Right.
And there is
because there's still the rest of the 7th Coalition to contend with.
Right. There's 500,000 dudes. And Charles Esdale, Professor Emeritus from Liverpool, who's written, no fan of Napoleon, to be sure, but I think one of the great historians, or one of our great recent historians, has made the point unequivocally that the French were done with it. Would they put up with Napoleon because did they hate the Bourbons? Yeah, of course they did. Because Louis is a goof. He's a big fat goof who didn't understand that the world had changed out from underneath him. But the idea that they were going to put up with another decade of blood, treasure, and all this stuff being lost for Napoleon's glory. That's crazy.
Their manpower was depleted.
Yes,
they had one field army at that one big field army. At
Yeah,
that
I
period,
was going to
right?
ask you if Napoleon. Let's say
This was
Napoleon-
not the France of 1809, right? Or 1800, let alone 1805, where there's multiple huge French field armies. There's one in 1815. The French are done. They have just been fighting constantly.
Okay, so they were sick of it. This was like Vietnam in the States, man. It's over.
Oh, worse than that, because Vietnam was never a significant drain, like not even a noticeable drain on American manpower.
right.
But the war weariness of it, yeah, probably still worse, actually.
But you know what? Him being the smart guy that he was, didn't he know that?
No, well, you understand the predicament he's in. Let's take as credible his belief or his statements that all he wanted was peace. I don't see how he ever thought they were going to give it to him. Because they didn't think they had to. In 1813, when he turns down, in 1813 into 1814, when he turns down Dresden, when he turns down Leipzig, and I've gone back and forth a little bit with Professor Esdale about whether or not those allies were ever serious. But if you take that, I get his argument. In 1814, they're willing to give him a deal where he can go back to the throne status quo ante. They tell him that because they don't want to go after this guy because they're afraid of him for a good reason. They are scared of this dude. And so, they're willing to go back, give him back their borders. Napoleon doesn't buy it. He doesn't think he can stay on the throne if he doesn't keep bringing France victories. Now, Charles puts a little bit more unsympathetic turn on that. He says basically he's a lunatic who's an egoist and can't handle not being the great conqueror.
I would think so.
Maybe. But whatever the reason, he turns it down. And when they turn it down, go to Paris, get the Treaty of Fontainebleau signed, and he abdicates. They're in France. He's gone. They've whooped him. Now, and they've parked, specifically to spite him, they've put Wellington in charge of occupying France and Belgium. That's an insult, and it's a deliberate one. And so the idea, they were just never they weren't going to split apart or make peace with him in the way that he had hoped. Just wasn't going to happen.
And as Scott Bell mentions, the coalition had pretty much kind of figured out how best to fight Napoleon by then. This is very evident in the Leipzig campaign and then later in the campaign in France in 1814 of you fight the battles where Napoleon is not. You fight his subordinates, many of whom, Davout being the main exception, are not really all that good at independent commands. And that's just a way that Napoleon operated, right? Relatively few of those marshals were ever really good at operating independently, again, except Davout, who proved himself time and time again. And a couple of the other ones who were okay at independently commanding stuff were dead by the, like Massena, for example, were dead.
Yeah, and I was about to say, if you talk, and that's the issue. I was going to name Massena, and some of them were competent. They could do it. They weren't disasters like Berthier was when he gave him an independent.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was not Berthier's strong suit. Was actually running the show.
Yeah, he was
what was that? Was that period when Napoleon had all his generals, Davout, Ney, other ones I can't even think of? This must have been the greatest clique of generals in history, man.
So yes and no.
You know what I'm saying? Like, what a power.
On the what? Well, sure. I mean, they're the dominant land power of the era, right? I mean, that's why it takes everybody fighting with them for 15 years to finally get rid of the guy.
Well, the Nazis didn't have that.
But a lot of the military prowess is Napoleon. But then behind Napoleon, you've got somebody like Berthier, who's like the greatest chief of staff of all time, right? Mm-hmm. And then in 1815, of course, Napoleon doesn't have Berthier anymore. So the whole idea of having like a general staff was an effort to put because you can't have another Napoleon. There isn't another one. So instead of Napoleon, who would just keep all these considerations in his head, you'd have this general staff, which would be like 10 or however many people it is, that would kind of collectively try to be as clever as Napoleon. But the coalition, and I'm not sure who came up with this. It may have been the Russians. Pursued the strategy in 1813 and 1814 of fighting battles pointedly against French forces where they knew Napoleon was not the person in command.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, no, and I think
Napoleon's coming, we're leaving, right?
Right. The only thing the only general thing I would say about that period and about what Napoleon was struggling with, just go to Wagram. At Wagram, 1809, the system breaks. To Artie's exact point, he can't command a battle that big. It's so expansive, and I mean, it's funny because when you go out and when you visit the battlefield there, it is amazing how flat it is. I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned by
who can't command a battle that big,
and it's at Napoleon. He can't because
and Napoleon has the authority concentrated in himself, right?
Yes.
He's the commander. His subordinate marshals were a lot of times kept on relatively short leashes.
Yeah. And when Davout goes off and does what he does at Auerstedt, awesome. When he goes off and does other things, but Augereau, Oudinot, Massena was good in independent command, but hey, let me give him a plug. Epic History has a great series on the marshals. Goes through all the marshals and grades them worst to best. The example that I always use is Mortier, the big mortar, just a decent marshal, but was he a bright star in the firmament of military history? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He functioned well in the system that he was given. And when you get to Wagram and it gets so big and the numbers get so huge, and this is going to matter even more going into 1812, the army becomes polyglot.
Yes.
The army that Napoleon takes into Russia in June, he doesn't invade Russia in the winter, people. Crush that meme in our lifetimes. He invades Russia in the summertime, actually in the early summer. When Napoleon invades Russia, there's a whole lot of Saxons and Württembergers and Baden and Italian. There's a ton of Italian troops. There's a whole Italian division, corps. And so it's there's a lot of guys. There's Austrians that are forced to go along and guard the southern flank. So those problems of logistics, those problems of control, to your point about staff colleges, without it, it was too much. It becomes too much. I will not dispute with you to say that was. And the other thing is, they were deep rivals with each other, which cost Napoleon dearly. The most, everybody knows how much I hate Bernadotte. There are those who criticize me for this, but I despise Bernadotte, who, by the way, his accession to the Swedish throne was just commemorated a couple days ago. But Bernadotte hates Davout so much that when he knows he should be riding to his aid at Jena Auerstadt, marches a completely different direction.
That's insane.
Takes an entire corps and just walks away, leaving Davout to defeat the Prussian army by himself, which he does.
That's insane.
But
with a corps.
Davout wants to kill him. Davout literally wants to kill him, and Napoleon seriously thought about letting him. So and they were deep rivals.
Jim, was Napoleon? Did he take counsel well from his generals? You know what I'm saying? Or did he pull a Hitler? And not that I'm comparing Hitler's idiot mind to Napoleon's genius.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think he took it better on an operational level than he did on a tactical level. It always seemed, and there are people who argue this, that Napoleon is saved more by his generals than he actually wins himself. I'm not in that camp.
Okay.
Because the fight at Jena Auerstadt, one of Napoleon's greatest fights, Napoleon's fighting the rear guard. Davout is fighting the army. You know, Davout is fighting the actual army. So I don't know where I fall on that, but taking that is a hey, that is such a fascinating conversation to me personally, because you'll see it if you watch the greatest movie of all time, Waterloo.
It's definitely the greatest cavalry charge on film of all time, and it's not close.
Waterloo with who? With
Rod Steiger and Christopher Plummer.
Rod Steiger, okay.
Yeah. You know, it's if you watch that movie, you'll see him throwing temper tantrums, you know, arguing with his generals. I think something that who was it? I'm trying to remember which historian I just finished listening to. It's one of the biographies, one of the recent biographies of Napoleon, made a really great point about him. One of the things that's often said about Napoleon is he was awful with women. Absolutely awful. Wellington and Napoleon had the same mistress at one point. She was an actress that they both betted.
Seconds, man.
Yeah, I think Wellington got the seconds, is my understanding. But they asked her to compare the two, and she just shook her head and said, Wellington. Napoleon was famously bad with women, and why do I bring that up? It's because this historian pointed out that from a very early age, when he was sent to the military academy, really throughout his life, he has really only the company of soldiers. He trusted soldiers implicitly. See, and that's a very striking contrast with Hitler, who never trusted the Prussian military aristocracy. Napoleon trusted.
That's why there was a Waffen SS.
So
that there would be an arm of the military that was personally loyal to him.
Right. And Napoleon adored his soldiers. I mean, it's perverse because he sent so many of them to die, but he preferred their company. He ate with them. He slept with them. He marched with them. He was really most comfortable with them. And so if there was an argument, if there was a back and forth, I think it came from a professional respect. He was far harsher and frankly far worse at the diplomatic stuff that he was also responsible for.
Napoleon.
Yeah. Talleyrand, for example, was far better
for itself.
Your diplomacy. He just hated the guy. He knew he needed him because he was better at it than he was. But he just clearly never trusted him, and he shouldn't have, because Talleyrand was not to be trusted. Yeah, I mean, hey, Napoleon, could you hand me that glass on the shelf?
Jim, didn't Napoleon have political chops?
No.
Yeah, international diplomacy, not really. No, that's self-evident from the fact that everyone was in a coalition against him.
Well, I mean, didn't he walk into the, for lack of a better word, the French Senate and speak his mind, and everybody was like, "Yay!"
No, you're thinking of the coup of the 18th Brumaire, and that coup almost gets him killed. It's only because Murat comes in there and seizes control of the Senate building and gets him out of there. That he lives. No, his political judgment is rarely good. And I'll give the biggest example, and the thing you absolutely have to hold against him, and it drives you nuts. He keeps insisting on putting this long string of Italian family on the thrones of Europe. He's got a completely easy route to a docile Spain. They've got a guy. He's a useless, dotard old king who will happily be his puppet for the rest of his life. But Napoleon doesn't want to do that. He wants to stick his brother on the throne. A brother who's no bloody good at it. In the Netherlands, he sticks his brother on the throne. And Louis is actually one of my favorite of his siblings. Why? He actually wants to do the right thing by the Dutch. They love the guy. He runs the country well, runs it fairly, tries to act in their interest. And Napoleon suddenly has to start sending him letters saying, hey, wait a minute, you run this place for me, right? He goes, no, I like these people. And they like me. I'm going to take care of them.
They're so nice and Dutch.
They're so Dutch. They got good weed. They're great people, and I want to represent them. And Napoleon's like, that's not why I put you there. And so he kicks him out. That and the fact that he marries somebody he doesn't like.
The most talented of Napoleon's relatives was the one that was not related to him, however. That was Eugene, Josephine's son.
Right.
Who's very talented.
Yeah, his stepson, Eugene Beauharnais, he's actually really good and also fiercely loyal for reasons, I swear to God. I have visited Beauharnais' tomb. Okay, his tomb is in Munich. And I've been there, and I stood there staring at his corpse in the. I didn't open the coffin; it was in the coffin, and I just stood there staring at the coffin, going, "Why were you so loyal? You know, you're the one guy." And I mean, it's amazing when I build all these battles in Tabletop Simulator. It's amazing how many times I'm making a Ojen Bornefig. He's always there, and he's always doing a competent job. And Artie's right. He's not he's not a blood relation. All these other blood relations he keeps foisting on everybody, and they infuriate people.
The brothers are all clowns.
201.
Joseph specifically, that's the brother that he puts on the throne of Spain. They're all clowns.
So, Jim, I don't know if you can answer this, but why is this dictator, Napoleon, so revered now?
Oh, he's one of the greatest generals of all time.
Okay, regardless, this guy murdered, slaughtered millions.
Now you're being judgmental. No, I mean,
Napoleon's got a really, Jim can talk about this better than I can, but Napoleon's got a complicated legacy, right? I mean, certainly there's probably people in France that actually will hold him in great reverence.
Well,
and certainly he's held in great reverence in the wargaming hobby. But outside of that, the legacy of Napoleon is very complex. I mean, you have, on the one hand, you have all the military deaths and the 20 years of war, but on the other you have and Haiti. Let's not forget about that catastrophe. Yeah. And on the other hand, you have the Napoleonic Code and legal reforms and stuff like that, which have continued to have a positive impact, right?
Well, I mean, Quebec civil law is Napoleonic Code.
Right, and we've talked about that. So is Louisiana. We've talked about that before, and a bunch of other places in the world as well, right? So, I mean, otherwise, you were still looking at, stuff based on ancient Roman legal codes or English common law everywhere else.
Right. And so what, do we expect in 100 years Hitler to be revered like Napoleon is?
No, I don't, because I mean, the number one thing is, let's keep crystal clear. There's no argument I've seen that Napoleon was genocidal.
Right. Okay.
That he might not have liked the British very much, but I actually think I think he admired them, and he didn't understand why they weren't getting with the plan. I think despite his various statements to that effect, no, but Artie's couldn't be more right. It's with the historiography, and look, I was having this thought today because I was having a separate conversation online with a friend of mine who's an academic. We're going through a period where all the heroes are getting another look.
Yeah.
We're discovering feet of clay under a whole lot of, and I'm not talking about real dirtbags like Andrew Jackson, and Woodrow Wilson and people that are don't go there. I'm talking about reassessments of a whole lot of people. Abraham Lincoln, how do you judge the imperfections in Lincoln's plans?
Really, Lincoln's being
assessed. Yes. I mean, Lincoln wanted to, at one point in his life, wanted to send Africans back to Africa. He wanted to send African Americans back. He disputed their equality. He changed. He learned. And that's something I argue with people, is that it's very clear that Lincoln was always regarded his life as a work in progress. It's one of the reasons I personally admire him. He gave me a lot of my favorite quotations. My favorite quotation from Lincoln, bar none, it's a digression, but it's worth making. He said, "I never like it when a preacher preaches a sermon that's too certain. I always like it when it feels like he's punching at bees."
Well, hold on. You said Lincoln learned.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a politician, man.
Yeah. So, but you can see the trajectory over his life. Just watch the movie Lincoln. And I realize that's a derivative work, but from Team of Rivals. But it's still. I mean, we're going through a period in historiography where we're really going back and assessing. And Napoleon certainly has been getting it his whole since before he died. Is he an ogre? Is he a tyrant? Is he a dictator? Even before Haiti entered our radar, because it really didn't. That's a later accretion, but it's true.
So what would you say? Is he an ogre, a dictator?
Sure, he was.
Yes, of course.
He was, but here's the other piece of it. One of the other things that modern history has pointed out is it's wrong, and we have this tendency. We like to chunk our history, right? We like to have now the Napoleonic. It's like we're playing a big game of civilization. Now the Napoleonic era begins. All other eras are gone, And now until the modern era begins, we will have Napoleon and then he will stop. It doesn't work that way. If you take up the political history of Europe from 1648 and run it through 1789, notice before Napoleon, the French Revolution, you know, France is a problem for 100 years to Europe. You know, there's this guy, Louis XIV, that there had to be coalitions built to stop. Mm-hmm. What do you think the War of the Austrian Succession was? What do you think the War of the Spanish Succession was? There were coalitions to stop the territorial ambitions of Louis XIV and his 20 million Frenchmen, to borrow the title of a book. Napoleon fits into a broader piece of history. He is unique in his nature and in his character because he isn't of the old world. There are things that are new in him. But a lot of the challenges he faces didn't suddenly start in 1789. Why in 1789 is France broke? You know, why is it broke? Answer, many reasons. Some of them are over 100 years old. But one of the most proximate, remember those ships they sent over to help us win the war in 1783? Who do you think was paying for those? And they never got a nickel out of it. You know, they bankrupted themselves helping us.
And all the states got was Louisiana.
Yeah.
Well, that was actually Napoleon, though.
Yeah. Napoleon sells Jefferson, Louisiana. Why?
Because he needs the money.
Yes.
But why Louisiana? I don't understand.
Because they had it, or at least they had a piece of paper. That
well, they had a huge chunk. Well, you know.
Jesus.
Oh, well, I mean, it's a whole nother story. But remember, our concept of what exactly was west of the Mississippi was inexact. Let's put it that way. Yes, we had land surveys and things like that, but we were given away land that we weren't quite certain about. But the point only being, Napoleon fits into a broader history. So, was he a dictator? Of course he was. Of course he was. Was his power limited? In a measure, but for a period of time, I would run it 1804 until 1814 for about 10 years. No, that's a dictatorship. That's a dictatorship. And, you know, from the time he decides he's going to declare himself emperor and run off the rest of the consulate and the directory and, you know, do the other things he did. And did other nations suppress their press? Yes, they sure did. He got good at it. Did other nations operate a police state that would, you know, check up on dissent and imprison dissenters? Oh, yes. You know, was there, you know, so these things, you can point fingers all kinds of ways. It just that he did it in a way that linked it directly to his achievements as a military commander.
Jim, you said something about reassessing all these old generals and whatever in history, clay ground on whatever. Mm-hmm. So is General Lee just known now as a racist son of a bitch?
He would, I think, you know, it's fascinating. And this has been, I am no American, you know, Americanist. I want to be careful because this is a very deep stream.
No, I understand.
But if you went to your shelf and if you lined up all the books that have been written about Robert E. Lee, and there's a lot of them, I've probably got 24. If you lined up 24 books on Robert E. Lee, you would watch, say from I'll just take more recent books, 1940 to 2010, probably a little sooner. It's all very, the gentleman of the war, what is it? One book was called Clouds of Glory, telling his story. Since that time, he'd be fortunate not to be fired directly into the sun.
But so we're removing his genius of the field.
Well, just like Napoleon, let's not pretend that Lee never had his blind spots as a military leader.
Well, of course.
And in fact, he was trying quite hard to be Napoleon, right? He was in the Napoleonic Club at West Point, for example.
So was George McClellan, which is far more offensive to me. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's the little Napoleon, right?
There you go.
Or the young Napoleon. Sorry, but. I mean, there's a lot of mistakes that Lee made. Yeah, he won some amazing tactical victories in a lot of places, but you know, and again, you could say this about Napoleon too, you know, and Jena Auerstadt being the obvious example of if Davout's not there, boy, that situation looks very different at the end of the day, right?
Yep.
Stonewall Jackson did the same thing for Robert E. Lee more than once. And Jackson had his problems as a military leader too. None of these individuals is like omniscient, perfect, and of unquestionable genius. Lee really did some amazing work, and these guys don't. None of these situations evolve in a vacuum, right? So Lee looks really brilliant at the conclusion of the Peninsula Campaign, right? There's a Union invasion of the Virginia Peninsula, and there's a large Union army led by McClellan that's advancing up the peninsula, and Lee completely shuts it down. But at the same time, there's another guy involved, McClellan, right, who is consistently being told by our good friends, the Pinkertons, that he's outnumbered like 3-1. And so he acts very conservative. This is a classic McClellan problem, right? He acts very conservatively and gets outmaneuvered by Lee, right? So a lot of Lee's brilliance or most brilliant performances happen against clownishly incompetent Union leadership, right? For one thing. And some of the things that happen is like, hey, if Stonewall Jackson hadn't managed to get these people there in an unforeseeable amount of, unforeseeably quick amount of time, then the battle looks very different, for example. So, and there's battles like that, like, second Manassas, for example. So I mean, these things are all more complicated than these one-line things of, oh, Lee was a genius, Napoleon was a genius. I mean, okay, but these things aren't, that's not the only variable in the equation, right? It's a very big equation with a lot of factors leading into it and leading out of it, regardless of what the result looked like at the end of the day.
Look, I'm not talking politics. Screw politics. I'm not talking politics because I know you guys are in a delicate situation being Americans, but I'm not talking politics. I'm just talking about the facts, only the facts, ma'am. Look, what did Lee have? He basically did he have a professional army, or was it just farmers and hay throwers?
Well, there's no question
that farmers and hay throwers that were professionally trained by the Union.
There's no question that about 1863, there's a noticeable difference in the quality of the officer corps between the Confederate and Union Army.
And look what he did with that.
Yeah, well, yeah, they kept fighting, right? But they kept fighting for 4 years, but it wasn't enough. But the quality of Confederate leadership would tend to drift down a bit as the conflict went on, and the quality of Union leadership would tend to drift up a bit as the conflict went on. And those two things combined with the manpower situation, which wasn't exactly, it's also an oversimplification to say, oh, the Union had as many men as they needed, right? It was not that simple. And a game like actually War Between the States kind of shows that effectively, as much as I criticized it on the stream yesterday, of the political costs of calling up additional rounds of draftees. So,
oh yeah.
Look, man, I don't know much about the history of the Civil War, but I remember looking at a map at one point, I think early on the Civil War, and if the Union didn't buck up, man, things would have been different. I mean, I'm looking at that map and it's like, Jesus, man, they're in Pennsylvania, for God's sakes.
Yeah, but
yeah, but if you look at the map, I mean, they weren't that far into the Pennsylvania, right? I mean, it's not like they were in Maine, right?
I think though, the thing that I always step back from is the problems that the Union had were twofold, and it was always from the beginning. They've got to win. They can't not lose.
Of course they can't.
The Confederacy had the advantage of being able to not lose and getting the Union to stop, to say, and that was a real issue. I mean, that was a real issue to get them to say stop. But so number one, but number two is going to Artie's point, and I think it's well taken, is that Lee himself says that one of his biggest concerns is someday he's going to get a general on the Union side that he doesn't get. He got all of he was very happy as long as George McClellan was on the other side of the field, because he got him. He understood him. He knew him. And that advantage, you know, the fact that they could paint logs and make them look like guns and get the Pinkertons, as you say, oh my God, they've got these huge batteries and millions of guys. And you read these histories, even as a kid, I'm reading, well, shoot, I'm building for Bloody Big Battles on Tabletop Simulator. I'm building Antietam. And it's one of the great challenges in wargaming. How do you make Antietam fair as a game? Because there is no game, well, I won't say no. The number of gamers that will be as given the knowledge they will have just looking at the map and looking at the troops deployed on it, the number of gamers that won't just freaking attack
everywhere,
every place at the same bloody time. So the game has to spend half its effort, you know, basically tying a lead weight to your leg. Why was that? It wasn't because really of inferior Union troops, although they were. It wasn't because of inferior or superior, you know, Confederate esprit de corps. It's because you have a dingbat running the show. And a guy who's, as you say, being fed bogus information of the first order of magnitude. And again, I'll go back to the Antietam field. So you look at it, go, you had a corps. You had an entire corps that you
sitting there,
smoking cheroots.
Look, that's hindsight. That's
a bridge
and spitting seeds. You know, and why? Why did Lee know he could do what he did? Because he knew George McClellan.
But you know, you said something about them faking logs as artillery or whatever.
Yeah.
What the hell did the Brits and the Americans do before D-Day when they were working up for D-Day? They had these fake tanks. Same thing. It worked.
Yeah, and well, it and multiple movies do this. I know Longest Day
Germans
does
did stuff like that too, for the record.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's there. In fact, if you play Too Fat Lardy's Chain of Command, it's an actual rule in their Blitzkrieg 1940 rules, their 1940 expansion, that's called a dirty Nazi trick. And basically, it allows you to, if you succeed in your dirty Nazi trick, it's a disguised German who incorrectly directs reinforcements to the battlefield, and those reinforcements don't arrive this turn. So, you know, of course, that's part of warfare. But shoot, watch any of well, I shouldn't say any. Longest Days got it. I'm fairly certain that
with the Gummi Poopin'?
Yeah, the Gummi Poopin'. No, those are great too. The Gummi Poopin'. I love that. That's one of my favorite phone calls in movie history. Boss? It's but no, it's Longest Day and Bridge Too Far, and Patton itself, where they show the German high command saying, well, who are they going to send, Montgomery or Patton? And they all laugh and go, well, of course they're going to send Patton. Why wouldn't they send Patton?
Right.
A false understanding at a high command of something that foundational, that fundamental, you know, leads to very, very bad decision making. And going back to Napoleon at the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt, you know, Davout fights an incredible battle, exhausts his Third Corps. I mean, the losses are staggering, which not a surprise considering the odds against him, and the fact that he's facing Blücher, who's no joke himself. But you know, so there's this huge fight. He goes down to Napoleon, who it turns out has only been fighting the Prussian rear guard down at Jena.
And thinks he's fighting the entire army.
Yeah, and he thinks, well, I just licked the entire army. And he gets a message from Davout saying, sir, I have the pleasure to report to you that I've just defeated the Prussian army. And Napoleon, who knows, much like myself, Davout is very nearsighted. And he sends this insulting letter back saying, tell your master that surely he's seeing double, for I have fought the army. You know, and you know, he insults him this way because Napoleon takes that as a slight. So what are you talking about? I beat the army. It was me. And you know, so the fog of war is real, affects even Napoleon on the very field of battle. He could see what he saw, and yet he was completely wrong about what he was fighting. He beat him, but it wasn't what he thought he beat.
Bloody hell, Jim, you're amazing. God damn. Anyways, it's too bad that we don't have a tavern that's close by, because I swear to God I'd be paying beers. Look,
WBC.
Okay, Jim, last question, Jim. First war game and why?
You mean board war game?
Yeah.
because my first war game was tabletop.
What do you mean? Yeah, right.
Miniatures.
No, I mean miniatures.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay, I tell the story if I get to. Cool. I was 13. Yeah, I was 13 years old, 1979. And I had been watching 60 Minutes because that's what my dad would watch on Sunday night. And they did a segment on these cool college kids playing this game, Dungeons and Dragons. And I was of course a huge Tolkien nerd, and I saw these miniatures because they were unpainted lead minis this was the chainmail era where they're moving them around tactically. I'm like, that's the coolest thing in the history of cool things. I wish to play this. And so I said to my mom, I said, Mom, I have to play this game. I just have to. She's like, well,
Christ, you speak like it's history. Okay,
well,
go.
well, it is. It's my sacred history. It's what I got. And so she says to me, well, where the heck am I going to get this? My sainted mother. And and so I that's just, and I'm like, I don't. Okay, so I go into the phone book. Look it up, kids. I go into the phone book, and I don't even know what I'm looking for. I'm looking up Dungeons and Dragons. Like, not a thing. So finally, I get to games, and under games, they list a store on the east side of Milwaukee on Downer Avenue called Napoleon's, and they advertise, we have Dungeons and Dragons. And so I'm like, please, can I go? I got to take a bus. My mom ain't driving me. I'm on a bus, the big green limousine. And I got my paper route money, and I'm going. And I go to this place, and I go to Napoleon's, and I walk in. And downstairs is a table 32 feet long by 4 feet deep, covered in 25 millimeter minifigs Napoleonics. It was as close as I've gotten. Yeah, the sounds emerged, the light emerged, and I went, oh my God, I am doing this. And so, now bear in mind, in 1979, this was not a hobby for kids. This was a heavy investment in lead and paint and all the other stuff.
Bucks.
These are guys with careers. One of them was the son of a U.S. senator, a bunch of cops, doctors, lawyers, all this other stuff. And I'm some squeaky voiced kid just going, ah, 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 ah. And I'm like, okay. And none of the internet.
Christ.
There's no internet. There's no nothing. They give me, I'm not making this up. I say, well, if you want to play, you can play one of the countries we don't have. I'm like, okay, well. And say, well, that's the Dutch Belgians. And I'm like, looking back in retrospect, they's a bunch of dicks. Okay. 40 years on, dicks. And so I start learning how. And it's a long story. I eventually got in because they played house rules. They were really awful. I've got them sitting right here. But they're just horrible homebrew rules. Oh my God, they're bad. But I learned them better than any of them. And so I kind of became the official young kid croupier. Just like, all right, Jim, what are my odds over there? All right, +1, roll D6. And just kind of what I do on Saturday Night Fights, and it was, all right, and all right, so Jimmy, get on that, literally climb on the table and move those guys. And when you're done, get me a beer. And because of that, I eventually started collecting my armies.
This is great.
They gave me armies that I could play with. I actually wound up with a Dutch Belgian one and a pretty beat up Russian one. And then I built my own Prussian one in addition to my French one. So that's how I got in, and I have never left since.
Jim, it's amazing. It's amazing. We got to let you go. And I'm going to say here publicly, Artie, it's at your tavern next week.
Correct.
And me, I want to have this guy over here, okay?
Well, we can swing that. I'll happily have Jim on whenever he wants.
I got questions.
He's always got questions.
It's questionable.
I have questions like, where are my pants?
Hey, Jim, thank you so much for doing this. Artie, thank you so much for doing this. This is great. This is what I wanted. I just want to sit down, have a beer, and you guys talk, and me once in a while say, yeah, but what about that? I think that's just fantastic.
Great talk.
What a blast. Who needs TV?
I don't even know what that is. A pleasure to be with you both.
So, people, thank you very much. I think we had, I don't know how many thousands of people watching
right
today,
now.
but we had 55 people just here watching. So I don't know what it is on my channel, but we're doing good there. We're doing good. So thank you very much. And I'm going to shellac this show. All righty?
Everybody have a great night.
People.